About a month ago, after I saw RRR in theaters for the second time, I came home and I realized I was thinking about Babel by R.F. Kuang. When I started unpacking this thought process, I started to realize that these are exactly the same story, but being told as sort of mirror images of each other, and this was fascinating to me, so I wanted to unpack that. Unfortunately, I cannot have the discussion I want to have without involving heavy spoilers, so there will be spoilers, and if you have seen one but not the other, and the fact that I say that they are very similar makes you interested in the other, I would advise caution because on the surface they are very different. RRR is a Tollywood action film, and Babel is a dark academia novel. And they take place in historical settings with fantasy elements, and they center around two men and two women, and they are both about a fight against the British Empire that culminates in violence. So, violence warning as well. Now, front and center of both of these stories are the two men. In Babel, it's Rami and Robin who meet and instantly connect, and their relationship is completely foundational to the story. It is probably the most compelling relationship within the book, but it is not a plot element. It is just there. Of course, their relationship has its ups and downs, but it doesn't really affect the plot. And this is probably one of the reasons why the personal details of their relationship is not really made clear to us, the reader. It's clear that they're in love, but to what degree this is an actual relationship, and to what degree it's just feelings that they're not acting on because Robin is so scared of what society would say or do to them, that is not made clear. Now, meanwhile, in RRR, Raju and Bhim are completely central to the story. The relationship between them is the love story around which the film revolves. This is a friendship, not a romance, but the relationship is the plot. The relationship between them and its ups and downs, these are what keep us invested as viewers. Now, in each story, the women, one is a woman of color and one is an English woman. The woman of color is vital to the plot in both properties, and she's also my favorite character in both. They are both characterized with a certain amount of defiance against authority. So Victoire and her passion to see Haitian Creole treated as a language in its own right as it deserves, and Sita helping Raju to break his father's rule about no one using his guns. Arguably, it sounds like Sita maybe even pushed him to do so. Sita has very little screen time compared to the men, and therefore she's much less well developed than Victoire. But the extent to which she made such a compelling character and such an impact on the plot despite having so little screen time is really impressive to me. Now, the Englishwomen are used to display the gap in lived experience between the characters of color and the English people whom the empire is built to serve. Both of these stories culminate in violent attacks upon the British Empire, and the way the white character responds to these, I think, is very much indicative of what the story was trying to do and how they decided to approach it. So not all violence is created equal. I think we can all agree on this. But there are so many different kinds of violence. RRR has two kinds. The violence which is by the Empire, directed at innocent people who don't deserve it, and the retaliation of our heroes against the Empire. Babel has these two kinds, but they're not really front and center the way that they are in RRR. In Babel, the violence of the Empire is mainly seen in the background against characters who are not our main characters. And it's displayed in a more roundabout way. And there's only really one act of retaliation which our heroes do, which is at the very end when Robin brings down the Tower of Babel. Through most of the story, the sorts of violence that we see are two different types, and these types are the violence that follows the othering of non-white, non-male people in England in the 1830s, and the other kind is the murder of a human life in a moment of fear or anger. Because RRR only really has these two types where it's very, very easy to identify who is the good guy and who is the bad guy in these situations, RRR basically uses the violence to give us emotional lows and highs. So if we have sat through the first half hour of terrible, terrible violence being done against people who don't deserve it by the Empire, including by Raju himself, by the time that we start seeing our heroes retaliate with violence, we are primed to appreciate it because we have spent so long watching innocent people get hurt by these exact same people that now we are watching our heroes attack. Any moral complexity in RRR is devoted to the fact that Raju is ultimately trying to help his people. But in the process, he is doing harm to people who don't deserve it as an instrument of the Empire. All the moral complexity is swept out of the window by the time that we reach our final confrontation, where Raju and Bheem kill Governor Scott and his terrible wife and bring down the barracks. Every single named character that we see die has specifically demonstrated themselves to be cruel people. And so there's not a lot of moral complexity there for us to grapple with. And this feeds directly into how Jenny reacts, because Jenny, during the midpoint fight at Governor Scott's mansion during the party, I interpret it as that she was very shocked that her nice friend Akhtar was doing this terrible violence. But then, shortly after that, she sees Bheem being whipped with this terrible spiky whip that her aunt pulled out of nowhere, and her aunt saying, "I want to see more blood," and her uncle screaming, "I want to make him kneel." And she knows that all of this is just because Bheem was trying to rescue Malli, who had been abducted in the first place. So she sees this, she sees that it is wrong, and she ends up allying herself with our main characters. We're not given an explanation as to how, she just does. We're not given an explanation as to where she went at the end. She's just there, I guess. Babel is a story that in another storyteller's hands would have been either about the characters rising up within the system to change it from within, or about the characters attacking the British Empire and bringing it down and changing everything. And one of the reasons I love this book is because it does neither. This is a story about people who realize that they are being brought up and trained to become part of a system that oppresses so many people who don't deserve it, including the countries of their origin. And they want to fight back. But there's no clearly moral way to do so, because to do so within the system is to try to argue with people who are, of course, motivated not to listen. To work outside the system is widely seen as immoral. Robin himself grapples with this through most of the book. And even though it is him who does the final act of retaliatory violence, even though it is him who sacrifices his life to bring down the Tower of Babel, he only really does this because he's gotten caught on a flow of tragic events happening around and to him. This also feeds into how Letty reacts when she finds out about the Hermes Society and what her friends plan to do. Jenny and Letty are both portrayed as very privileged compared to the other three main characters. Jenny and Letty both come from a place where they are part of a system that is doing harm, but they don't necessarily recognize this. Because RRR does not leave the realm of Governor Scott and his terrible wife, we don't really see how Jenny would react to Bheem and Raju saying that they wanted to bring down the whole empire. She's basically given a situation where there are terrible people doing terrible things to innocent people, and she picks a side. She doesn't really have to grapple with the system as a whole. Whereas Letty does. When Letty is placed in the situation where Robin has killed Professor Lavelle, whom she knows was his abusive father, she very much takes the same view as Jenny does. She is on board with them trying to help Robin by hiding the body. Of course she has anxieties later and suggests that they could go through the system, but so do all of them. They are all grappling with the weight of what they have done in concealing a murder. Letty is not at this point significantly different from the others. When this changes is when she finds out about the Hermes Society, which her friends did not tell her about on purpose. She only finds out about the Hermes Society because she overheard a conversation that they were having while they thought she was asleep. Of course, this probably feeds into her mistrust of them because they did not tell her, and she knows. And they would not have chosen to tell her had there been a choice, had she not overheard this conversation that she was not meant to hear. We are presented with the Hermes Society as something that the characters are already grappling with. Even Robin himself grapples with it. And this is one of the major rifts that emerges between him and Rami, because to Rami, that's the Hermes society is the bare minimum. Robin is actually probably pretty aligned with Letty in the way that he thinks about it, up until he has no choice but to pick a side. I think this is particularly interesting because Robin's murder of Professor Lavelle and Letty's murder of Rami, I think they were in very similar headspaces when they committed these murders. And I think it is very reflective of the fact that these two can sort of pass as a member of society. Of course, Letty suffers for being a woman and Robin suffers for being half Chinese, but they have certain privileges of hiding that their friends do not. And this contributes to their attitude toward the Hermes society. Even Robin's. Even though Robin knows about the violence of the Empire against his people, as long as he can keep his eyes shut, he does keep his eyes shut. It takes a very long time for him to accept that the system that he is in is contributing to so much harm. Letty does not have the chance to have this same moment of realization as Robin does. Letty does her best to understand what her friends are trying to explain to her, but at the end of the day, she has to make a choice, and she chooses to go with her own lived experience. I think this is incredibly understandable. I love the way that Letty is written. I think we need more characters like her, because I think it's a very common phenomenon, especially because they are all existing inside of the same system. And from Letty's perspective, she has had to fight so hard to get to where she is. The idea that her friends are not satisfied with that and would want to try to bring the whole system down is mind-boggling to her. She doesn't have the luxury of time to think about it and come to terms with it. She's just sort of thrust in the deep end and has to make a choice. Because of the ways that the stories are presented to us, the narratives make us come away with very different feelings. But at the end of the day, they end in the same place, where our heroes have done one massive blow against the British Empire, but it still stands, and it's going to come after whoever survived. In fact, after the first time I saw RRR, after we left the theater, my friend turned to me, and the first thing she said was, "Why do Indian movies always have such sad endings?" And I said to her, "Well, I thought that was a pretty upbeat ending." And she said, "No, but the British aren't just going to leave them alone after that. They're going to die." And this is true. The real life people on whom Bhim and Raju are based both did get killed by the British before India ever achieved independence. When we talk about Indian independence, I think most of us these days tend to think about Gandhi and his non-cooperation movement. I think most of us consuming these media now live in societies where we can take peace for granted, where if people are asking for change, we expect them to go about it peacefully and not cause harm. I think it's not uncommon for us to look at protests where there are violent actors, and if there is violence, we end up discussing the violence and condemning the violence and talking less about what was the protest about. In some cases, we might not even discuss the contents of the protest at all and get caught up in the violence. This is the degree to which we as a society abhor violence. And yet we have stories like RRR and Babel. I think one of the reasons why I love these two stories so much is because even though, of course, they are fiction, they are inviting us to remember that, of course, in the end, India won independence through peaceful non-cooperation, but that was not the whole story. Of course, the non-cooperation movement was built upon the backs of so many people who came before who fought the British, and of course they used many ways, and violence was one. In fact, I think a lot of us tend to forget that at the time, non-violence and peace as a protest movement was a very controversial thing, and there were a lot of people who believed that it would never work. Even though the non-cooperation movement and peaceful protest ended up giving the final push, of course this didn't happen in a vacuum. It wasn't like the British were unopposed and then there were some peaceful protests and the British said, "Aha, we understand. You don't want us here and it is immoral for us to be here. We'll go now." That's not what happened. It was deliberately made incredibly inconvenient and impractical for them to stay through various methods, violence being one of them, some of them being violent freedom fighters, and some of them being external violence, such as World War II. Now, society looks different today. So, of course, the things that were maybe considered acceptable during the independence movement are no longer considered acceptable. So I was not raised in India, but around 2005, I started attending high school in India, and my family lived there. Around this time, a movie came out called Rang de Basanti. Rang de Basanti is about a British filmmaker who comes to India to make a documentary about freedom fighters during the independence movement. She ends up without resources, so she makes friends with a bunch of disaffected college-age young people, and she convinces them to participate in her documentary. Now, these are people who are not interested in history, not interested in politics, but through contributing to her documentary, they start to realize the echoes of the freedom movement on their lives today with the corrupt government. This was a movie that was slammed by my teachers, by my parents. Now, the consensus of adults around me was that it is incredibly disrespectful to use the methods of the freedom movement on the government today. This was also in Hyderabad in 2005 or 2006. So this was during the Telangana independence movement. At the time, even though, again, largely the protests were supposed to be peaceful, sometimes there were riots, there were bombings, there were fires. And of course, you get used to it, but there is a baseline of stress that you end up having from living in an environment like that. I once had a teacher who went on a rant to us about burning buses, because during the independence movement, burning buses made sense. The buses are in India, but they are for the British to use. Even if Indian labor contributes to the buses, they are not for Indians, they are for the British. So you burn the buses. It's one of those things that people were doing to inconvenience the British, to make it as costly and impractical as possible for them to remain in India. But my teacher argued, burning buses now, those buses are funded by taxpayer money. It no longer makes sense to burn buses. It's a tricky line to walk of honoring all the people who built the world that we live in against the changing sensibilities of our modern world and what is acceptable now. The 1 year that I was in high school in India, the entire year, our history was about freedom fighters during the 20th century. And there were just so many people. The thing is, I was raised in a multicultural household, and it was not considered so important that I obtain certain cultural elements from India. But one aspect that I was educated on was the independence movement and what it means to live in a country where it is your land, but you are a second-class citizen. What it means to be a colony. My great-grandfather passed away before I was born, but I've been told that he loved his tea. He loved having his tea at exactly certain times of day. But when he was a child, tea was not a thing drunk by Indians. We think of chai as an Indian thing, but it's not a traditionally Indian thing. Tea came to India because the British wanted to grow. The British needed a climate in which tea would grow. They used Indian land and Indian labor to grow it, but it was for the British. During the Great Depression was when they started to sell it to Indians. So my great-grandfather, when he was a child, said that people from Lipton would be standing on street corners giving out free samples for the first time, trying to get Indians to buy it. It's a relatively recent addition to Indian culture, tea. And it's only there because of colonialism. We can't separate the society we live in from its current sensibilities. But I do really like that both Babel and RRR have chosen to honor the people who came before our modern era, who fought and fought and fought to try to end a system that seemed at the time so completely ingrained that it was impossible to topple. Because yes, both of these end in tragedy, and it's not sufficient what they did, but at the same time, it will succeed eventually. They have built a solid building block on which future generations can build. The people that RRR is honoring at the end, most of them were militants, most of them were people who were fighting the British using non-peaceful methods, and most of them were killed by the British and did not see India become independent, most of them. I'll include somewhere a list of the names if you're interested in looking them up. Subhash Chandra Bose is actually considered kind of controversial nowadays because one of the things that he did was he didn't agree with Gandhi that during World War II the correct thing to do would be to offer assistance to the British in fighting and then use that as a negotiating platform to get independence after the war. So he came to Japan and he made an alliance with the Japanese, basically saying that if they fought the British in India, then the Indians would fight with them. History has proven that it's probably a good thing that that didn't happen. The Japanese troops were actually on their way, starting to march when the Battle of Midway happened, and so they were called back, is the way it was taught to me. The other one is Bhagat Singh, who ended up executed because he threw a smoke bomb into an assembly. It was one of those protest gestures which he had never intended to be harmful. It was designed to be a harmless smoke bomb, and it was more about the gesture. But it was spun as that it was a bomb that failed to go off. The thing is, I talked about modern sensibilities, but the fact that violence is unpalatable is not actually a fully modern sensibility, because at the time as well, the British would often take violent things that freedom fighters have done and use those as a reason why they were not credible. And sometimes those were just spins. Sometimes those were not just allegations and not true. And even if they were true, it's very difficult to litigate now. What was correct? Eventually, the non-cooperation movement succeeded, but at the time there was really no guarantee that it would. And people who chose violent methods usually were still, I mean, they were still human. There was still a sanctity to human life. It becomes an incredibly difficult thing to talk about because so much of history is just a spin that somebody wrote down. I don't know how to end this anymore. I've filmed this 7 times. My throat hurts. I'm not going to do it again. I hope you can't hear my neighbor's machine, whatever that is. I can't help it. I desperately wanted to talk about this because I do think that while the non-cooperation movement was amazing, the fact is that I think to some degree we take it for granted now that peaceful protest just works. And at the time that was not the case, and that was one of the reasons why it was so amazing. And just because some people did not foresee that, and some people were using violence, does not mean that they were less instrumental in eventually winning India back its freedom. And Innuendo Studios made a really great video about what really is peaceful protest and what are we really saying when we look at other people asking for change and demand that they protest peacefully. And I highly recommend that you watch that. If for some reason you are still watching, thank you so much. Bye.